Since I started working at the college, it's been busy, and so that's why we haven't had PowerPoints that much, because that's in my preparation, that's what I've been failing, is the pictures. So, I could show you pictures and not say anything, or I could say something and not show pictures. But you'll know when I get caught back up, because then I'll have pictures. All right, and Brian asked if we could record Sunday school class, so now we have to be careful what we say in Sunday school class. And I can't be mean to the students anymore, or anything like that. Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to do part of Hebrews chapter 11 today, and the rest of it on next Sunday, Lord willing, we'll finish Hebrews 11 and go into Hebrews 12. But we will take a little bit of a rabbit trail today in the first few verses of Hebrews 11, and just talk a little bit about creation as it's mentioned here. So we'll kind of do that. It's good to have Pastor back. So evidently, you must have watched the video from last Sunday, and that's why Koo did not lead music today.
No, on Wednesday I told him you're going to be a victim of your own success.
So
I want him to have that job. He's not sure if he wants it right now.
Good.
So we'll ease him into it in the next 2 weeks.
All right, in the next 2 weeks. All right.
You did an excellent job.
Yes. No, I did too. I thought that was very good. All right, so Hebrews chapter 11. Now, again, by way of review, when we're looking at the book of Hebrews, we kind of break it between chapter 6 and chapter 7. Chapter 6 is kind of, and the end of chapter 5 is kind of a rabbit trail of its own. Okay, it's a side path from a conversation that actually starts in chapter 4, dealing with Melchizedek. But when we get to chapter 7, the author of Hebrews really starts to make his point about Jesus being our high priest. And he goes all the way in through chapter 10, talking about what it means that Jesus is a high priest and what it does for us. And in chapter 10, it results in the forgiveness of our sins. And the forgiveness of our sins that we have in Jesus is a permanent thing. The forgiveness of sins under the Old Testament sacrificial system was a temporary thing, in that you had to keep going back to the temple and keep bringing sacrifices. And Jesus' sacrifice was once for all, and it's done. And the temple is going away, so the people that he's writing to should not put their trust in the temple old sacrifice, old covenant way, because it's going to go away. So then in chapter 10, verses 19 through 25, he gives them the exhortation. And in 26, he starts with this warning, which is quite a dire warning. You could almost argue that it's as dire as chapter 6 as a warning is. And it concludes with, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And as I mentioned, it's written to believers who live in sin, live as if they're not even really Christians. Okay, they're just living with an apathy towards sin in their life. So we get to verse 32, and again he begins to encourage them by saying, recall the but, and that word but is actually in the original text, but recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, so after you were saved, you endured hard struggle with sufferings. And he describes some of the sufferings that they went through. And he says in verse 35, do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. And then he says, he makes this quotation, and then he says in verse 39, but we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Then we go into chapter 11. Okay, so now chapter 11 is sometimes called the Hall of Faith. where the author gives us a grocery list, so to speak, of people who did various things, lived, did miracles, were resurrected from the dead. Some of them died, suffered, died, were persecuted for Christ, but they did that all by faith. Now, chapter 12, verse 1 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses," who is the cloud of witnesses? All the people that he just mentioned in chapter 11. Okay, those are our witness to us, bear testimony to us. We'll talk about that in more detail when we get to chapter 12. But chapter 11 really is an encouragement that comes at the end of chapter 10, but he's also going to use chapter 11 to encourage them all the more in chapter 12. So again, outlining the book of Hebrews is very challenging. It can be very helpful as you look at how these pieces fit together. But chapter 11 certainly goes with chapter 10. And gives us more information about what does it mean, those who have faith, at the end of chapter 10, verse 39. Those who have faith and preserve their souls. Who are those who have faith? What does it mean to have faith? So he's going to tell us. He's going to answer that question. So, chapter 11, verse 1, now. This word now is important because it is kind of an interruption from chapter 10. So, it's kind of an interruption, but he's going to explain. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And this is kind of important, and it goes along with 1 Corinthians 13, by the way, because we have hope and faith paired together again here. And it is said that it's assurance of those things that are hoped for. And you've heard us say this, many times. This kind of hope is not the hope of I hope, can I say something like a football reference? I hope the Vikings win, but it's not likely that they will. Or I hope the Twins win the World Series. That might be a better one. There's not a lot of hope really in that, right? We kind of abuse the word hope when we use it that way. But this hope has an assurance. Okay, this is something we know is going to happen, and we anticipate it happening. We have a hope in the return of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, there's nothing I can do to prove to you by pointing to something around, the world that says Christ is going to come back and take us for his own. This hope, though, is given to us through the Scriptures, and it's solidified by the ministry of the Holy Spirit, and we have full assurance of this fact. So if someone, and we can even talk about this with our salvation, we talk about this with our assurance. John, if you were to die right now, would you go to heaven?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Any doubt?
No.
Not at all. That is an assurance that we have, and that's built in hope, because it's something that's going to happen. I told Brian, it's got the camera, I'm going to move around. But Brian hopes that I stay still. No, this fact that we have, this assurance that we have, is our hope. Our hope is really the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15. And that when we die, we will be resurrected and we will be with Christ. Now, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. We won't go down that rabbit trail, but we have that as a sure hope, and that is our assurance. There's no question. And it's one of those things that you can't really explain to somebody who doesn't have it. You can tell them about it. You can share that with them. Those are good things to do. But it's not like you can't convince them of it in and of themselves. It's something that we have. It's personal to each one of us. We all share it, but it's personal to each one of us. But it's an assurance of things hoped for. We have no doubt whatsoever. And when we have that assurance within us, we know it. We know that we have that assurance within us. It's there. Now it says, also, it says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Okay, so when we're talking about faith, we're talking about the conviction of things not seen. So here's an example. Are there angels in this room with us right now? Spirit beings. Okay. John believes so. Pastor says probably. Okay, most likely there are. Okay, so by faith we understand that that's the case. I can't prove that. They are things unseen. They are things that dwell in another world. I'm going to lose words, right? Dimension, something. Okay, so this unseen thing isn't like molecules or things that live in the bottom of the ocean that we can't see with our physical eyes, but if we had the right instruments, we could see them. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about things that we could not touch, see, hear, smell, taste, right? Our five senses are not going to make us privy to those things. So when you're talking to small children, sometimes, small children are very wrapped up in what's right in front of them. Of course, they can also forget what's right in front of them, but sometimes they're wrapped up with what's right in front of them, and teaching them about faith, trusting in a God that they cannot see, trusting in a man named Jesus Christ who is the Son of God. You can't prove that to them by letting them touch it and handle it. They have to understand these things by faith. So sometimes we talk to them about things they can't see. So we're having a discussion. Our girls were little. I don't know, Sophia was 5 or 6. And we're sitting around the dining room table, and we're talking about things. And there's Sophia and me and Jennifer, we're in chairs. Olivia was still in a high chair, I believe. So we had an empty chair at the table, because we just had 4 chairs. We had a small, round dining room table. And I said something about, well, there's nobody sitting in that chair. And Sophia said, well, unless it's an angel. Well, yes, you are right. You are exactly right. There could be an angel sitting in that chair. I don't know. But it's possible. So we're talking about things unseen. We're talking about things that are spiritual, like the angels, like God himself, like Jesus currently is unseen to us. Those are the types of things that we're talking about by being unseen. So verse 2, he says, for by faith, the people of old received their commendation. In other words, because they couldn't see God. Now, Abraham heard God, but they couldn't always see what he was promising them. And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but that hope and that faith, that trust that what God said was true, and they believed it with all of their heart and soul and mind, and even if they didn't understand it, they acted on it. They were commended by God to us because of their faith. Now, it says in verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made of things that are visible. Okay, so that the things which are seen, what we can see around us, were not made out of things that are visible. Okay, so this is the kind of rabbit trail I want to take this morning. This is the idea, the old idea of creation out of nothing. And you may have heard of that phrase, or the Latin phrase is creatio ex nihilo. And this is the verse that we get the idea that God created everything that we see, the entire universe. But he made it out of things that are not visible. In other words, matter, what we can see around us, feel, taste, touch, is not eternal. Okay, so what do we mean by that? So evolution teaches that matter, what we can, well, let me back up one step. I'll interrupt myself. We're talking about, when we talk about things that are not seen, science specifically deals with things which we can verify by the five senses, or we can at least experience by the five senses. If it's something outside the five senses, modern day science will say we have nothing to do with that. Okay, so in the old days, what you could talk about with your five senses was called physics, okay, because this is the physical world. And everything that existed that you could not touch with your five senses was called metaphysics, which was basically volume 2 of all things that exist. So Aristotle's very famous for writing 2 volumes, although they were like a lot of books, but 2 volumes. One, everything that we know about the physical world, he called physics, and everything else, which is not the physical world, he called metaphysics, or volume 2. And that's where the word metaphysics comes from. Okay, so science deals with the physical world around us, and scientists for centuries, for millennia really, said that there's a physical world around us that we can study, and there's a world that's unseen that we can also try to study as best we can, given what we know about this world. When science became more formalized in the 16th, 1700s, the scientists started saying, look, we have so much to look at in this world, we can't bother with what we don't know in the unseen world, spiritual things. We can't verify any of that the way we verify things in this earth, so we're not going to try. We're just going to limit ourselves to this. Now, by the 1800s, and depends on how you read Darwin, who published his Origin of Species in 1859, you have not such an agnostic view of spiritual things, but you really start to have an atheistic view of spiritual things. So the scientists today who would be considered cutting-edge scientists don't just say that there is no such thing as spiritual things, they say those things don't exist. Period. If you can't use your five senses, it doesn't exist. They don't say for the sake of the argument. They don't say for practical reasons. They don't say that's for theologians and philosophers to talk about. They just say it doesn't exist. And that's unfortunate. Pastor.
I just want to say one thing in their defense, not because I'm disagreeing with you, but I think it ought to be said, and that is that in these two categories, physics and metaphysics, scientists have been pulling things out of metaphysics into physics with more precise instruments for centuries now. And because of that, the arrogance probably of the scientists comes to this conclusion that since we pulled so much out of metaphysics, everything in there must be physics, and we'll eventually get around to it.
Yes, so pastors were saying that in some cases what basically they're doing is the physics have overtaken the metaphysics. And one place that you can see this is there's a book published not too long ago, I don't remember how long ago, called I think it's just called The Moral Landscape. It's by Sam Harris. Sam Harris is an amazing scientist, deals with the physical brain, but he's an atheist. So he's challenged with the question, where do you get right and wrong? Where do you get morality? and he wrote a book. Now, it's not convincing, but he wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, probably maybe within the last 10 years, and to try to answer that question. But when you get into right and wrong, you're no longer talking about what I can verify with my five senses. You're getting into metaphysics, but they try to bring one underneath the other one and say, we can handle all those questions by, in his case, looking at brains, okay, human brains. So their focus is on what can be seen, and they don't believe that anything that can't be seen exists. And that's kind of where things have gone to in science. So they on purpose, they kind of handicap themselves, but they acknowledge a good scientist will acknowledge the handicap. Okay, so that's why I pointed that out, that faith is the conviction of things not seen, because God created the universe by his word. So that what is seen was made out of things that were not visible. So modern day science will do this, and faith tells us that there's a different way to understand the world. And the things that we can see, there's a different way of understanding that, and that way of understanding the world around us has to start with faith. And in the old days, this was called faith-seeking understanding. Okay, that's in case you're interested. All right, so Genesis, if you don't mind, we can look at Genesis 1. I interrupted myself, and then I think I forgot to go back to where I was. So the doctrine of creation out of nothing comes from Hebrews 11:3, not out of Genesis, by the way. That's where I was going. Okay, I just remembered. So, is matter, so for an evolutionist, someone who believes in evolution, which as you can just tell, I just made that a matter of faith. Okay, one who believes in evolution. Someone who believes in evolution believes that matter, the physical world around us, is eternal. Okay, it has to have existed forever. It could not come into existence ex nihilo. Okay, it couldn't have come into existence if nothing existed. That's against the laws of physics as we understand them. Nothing can be created. Energy cannot be created. It's only transferred. So when Christians were confronted in the middle of the 1800s with modern science, and this somewhat predates Origin of Species, pretty much predates what's his name? Darwin. But Darwin was a good push. Christians began to struggle with this idea of evolution. Okay, because now science seems to be stating that it's a fact, and so how do we reconcile that with the Bible? So there are books written during this time period from 1850 to 1920, really, that 70-year period, maybe 1870 to 1920, by Christians who are struggling with this. Okay, the scientists are telling us that the earth must be, back then it was only millions of years old, that things evolved. God didn't create each animal after its own kind, but things morphed into other things. Man wasn't created singly in God's image, but he came out of the chimpanzees and things like this. So Christians were struggling with that. I have one book that says, I believe in God and evolution. And it was a pastor who was trying to reconcile these two things. Dake's Study Bible. I don't know if anybody's ever used a Dake's Study Bible. I grew up with one. My dad had one. So I grew up with that as my first study Bible. And Dake held to an evolutionary theory. He believed that there was a race of humans before Adam and Eve. That's where the story of Lilith comes from. And that between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, God destroyed that world and recreated it for Adam and Eve. He believed a lot of weird things. Okay, so I'm not promoting his study, but it's there in his notes. He's got it worked out. So one of the things, though, that Christians understood from the beginning, even as they wrestled with it, is God had to have created the matter out of which evolution occurred, right? Because it's even science has to say that all matter is eternal, so something's eternal, or there's somebody who created it. So Christians at least said, well, there's someone who created it, and he created it out of nothing, created it by speaking. Now, in speaking with there's some young men who were at the school. They're now in college in the cities, but talking to them about this, one of them was into biology. So he's like, well, what about this missing link? Or what about, this archaeological find? Or what about this? Or what about that? And he would keep going, go back to that God could have superintended the evolutionary process. This is sometimes called theistic evolution. And I kept asking him, if God had the power to superintend evolution for billions of years, could he not have the power to create it in 6 days? Could he just not have done that? Well, but what about the scientific evidence? What scientific evidence are you pointing to that couldn't be understood in light of God creating the world in 6 days? And they were young, didn't have a good answer. But, well, it doesn't matter how old you are, you still don't have a good answer. So in Genesis 1, I just wanted to talk about this, not too much, but to kind of expand it a little bit, and point out really why I hold to a 6-day creation, in light of even some of the current challenges by other Christians who are challenging. You have to understand the majority of Christians in America, I'll say that, probably do not hold to a 6-day creation. 6-day creation is probably a minority view. Dr. Jeff Straub, I'm sure some of you know him because I think he's been here before. Once you met Jeff, you can't forget him. I say that lovingly in case he watches the video. But Jeff went on one of these tours of the Grand Canyon that was run by one of the creation outfits down there, which I think is now run by someone who used to teach at Master's Seminary. And they're on the river raft going through, looking at the sides of the caverns, looking at all the evidence firsthand. And the person leading the tour is a young earth creationist. He believes that the earth was created in 6 days. And the number of people on that boat, the people they were trying to convince, were seminary professors from the United States. Okay, not Central Seminary, but other seminaries in the United States. Not Faith either. But because the idea of a young earth creation is not, it's not popular, and it's not fashionable. So people try to find ways around it. And a lot of times what they do is they look at the text and they try to make things up. So for example, one of the things you might have heard is, in verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day. That word day is used. Well, how long is a day? 24 hours. Well, but, in the days of Abraham Lincoln, well, I'm not talking about a 24-hour period, I'm talking about just a period of time. Generic. Okay. Well, so this is what people do. They come to Genesis 1 and they say, well, this isn't talking about 24 hours. This is just talking about some age of time. This is called the day-age theory, where Christians are trying to take the text of Genesis 1 and make it fit the evolutionary idea, account for that. Well, there's a problem with that, and I do hear this from time to time, this view that I'm about to say presented, but I don't hear it very often. So that's why I'm going to say it. But you probably already know all this. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, that without form and void is only found one other place in the whole Old Testament. I'll give you the reference. We probably won't be able to look at it today, but it's Jeremiah 4, verse 23. God is going to bring judgment on the city of Jerusalem, and in the longer passage, which is like verses 20 through 25, he's going to reverse the created order. And he actually walks through Genesis 1 backwards until Jerusalem is formless and void. Okay. Now, what I'll say about that is some people say, well, this is the state of chaos. This is the state of, in fact, they'll use that word chaos. This formless and void. You know, it was there was nothing there. It was chaotic. There was no life. There was just some wind on the seas, and this is what we see in the primordial world. Okay, well, I'm going to give you I'm going to throw something out there and see you can, talk to me about it later. But this idea of formless and void isn't necessarily chaos. We read into it chaos. But I like to think of it more of when you're starting with, and the best example I found is a painter. So I have a friend who's a painter. He has canvases all over the place, right? So sometimes he has a canvas that's a brand new canvas and it's blank, and maybe he's primed it, but it's sitting on an easel and there's nothing painted on it. You know what it is? It's formless and void. It's not chaos. It's waiting for him to paint something on it. It's his canvas. And I look at Genesis 1:2 like that. God created the heavens and the earth, and now the earth is ready for him to do creative acts on it. It's a blank slate, so to speak. It's a white canvas. But chaos is something that we read into it. There's nothing about chaos here. And nothing about chaos in Jeremiah 4. It's just cleaned off and ready to start over again. It's like taking a whiteboard and wiping it down, and you're ready to start. Pastor.
Okay, so we're used to thinking of certain things happening on certain days of creation. On day one, God created light and used it to separate light from darkness. Are you saying that on day one, God created more than that? That God created the heavens and the earth and light? Or were the heavens and the earth created at a time prior to day one?
So, it says, at the beginning, he created the heavens and the earth, and this was the state it was in when he started on day one. So what did he start on day one? So some people will hold, as Pastor just alluded to, that there is a gap of time between Genesis 1 verse 1 and Genesis 1 verse 2, or between verse 2 and verse 3. In other words, he created the blank slate and he came back 3 weeks later and started painting on it. Okay, I don't think that's the case. I think verses 1 and 2 are just setting the scene, and then he begins by speaking. Now we know that he spoke everything into existence. An interesting side theory is that he actually sang everything into existence. So God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And the end of verse 5 says, "And there was evening and there was morning." Now the ESV says, "the first day." Does anybody have a different translation? I think sometimes someone has a New King James or something.